Steve, I know that you watched the video yesterday and you and I exchanged a couple of emails, and I was quite keen to find out, what was your main reaction to what you heard? Do you agree? Do you disagree? How do you feel about some of the main points that were presented there?
I think agree or disagree is a bit too binary.
Fair enough. A nuanced answer.
One of the things that occurs to me, there are a couple of things that are linked in my mind, which I don't very much like. The first one is that connection between level and lexis. Mm-hmm. I mean, as a beginner in Swiss German, I happened to learn the word for forklift truck, which is interesting that you used it about 5 minutes ago on your, and I thought, that just reminds me. So that's a low frequency word, but I learned it very early on because I needed it, because I was doing some work in a warehouse and they told me to go and fetch the stapler. And so that kind of, in a way, introduces my mind to the idea that lexis shouldn't be linked to level. Okay. And I feel that this is too big a topic, really, but I think that learners should be encouraged to bring their own lexis. I think that lexical development is something which should be in the hands of your students rather than in the hands of the teacher. So there's kind of my first thought in a way.
And can I absolutely, I think, agree with you. I think in putting this presentation together, it was really sort of mediated through for many teachers will be their primary access in terms of teaching instruments as the course book. And I think because course books are primarily language level graded, very often now against the CEFR, necessarily that there is this kind of sense of, this word belongs here and this word belongs there. But I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that the kind of, we know from second language acquisition that an item will become most useful. At the point where the item becomes most useful, it becomes most memorable. And, I would absolutely agree with you. Mario Involucri once made the point that he delivered a C1 level class. At the end of it, I think it was a grammar class, and at the end of it, he asked the learners what were the most memorable things that you've learned today. And one student piped up, wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
And,
that's very interesting, because I had the same experience when I was teaching a class in Taipei, and I was doing something, and it's nothing to do with wheelbarrows or gardens, but a wheelbarrow came up in the lesson, and everyone wanted to know what it was and what it did, because they lived in high-rise buildings.
Right.
So that is for me a great indicator. Now, the other thing I wanted to really a challenge, I suppose, the idea that on the one hand, you can get by with very little grammar, and therefore there's an argument for having lexis, right? Which I accept completely. I can go into a shop and say, please, I wish this one, which for make stop rain, please, thank you. And they're going to give me an umbrella, right? No, there's no grammar or very little grammar, and there's the lexis is lacking. So the question that I have, which should really go to coursebook authors and publishers, is why on earth is not strategic competence part of the syllabus? Because that's where the key lies. If you don't have a word, just in case anyone's not sure about strategic competence, it's the ability to work around something that you don't know or unsure of, both in structural terms and in lexical terms.
Perhaps we could add not just in terms of strategic competence, but also things like repair skills. I was talking yesterday to my contact in a hospital in the northeast of England, where I'm running an OET program. For those of you who are perhaps less familiar with it, that's a medical English test, the occupational English test. And the point that had been raised by one of the ward managers was a concern whether the nurse in question really was picking up on and understanding things that she was being told. And it suddenly struck me, I've made the mistake of teaching to the exam really more than thinking about teaching repair strategies and clarification strategies. So absolutely. But is it not the case that the wider the meaningful and yes, student-selected lexical base that our learners have, the less likely it is that they're going to encounter these issues where they need to have strategic competence, repair skills, clarification skills. They absolutely still need to be taught, and we're never going to be able to be inside the student's mind to know this student needs X, Y, Z, this student needs A, B, C. And of course, with learner autonomy comes learner responsibility as well, to an extent. But yes, I mean, I think that's really very valid. I don't know if we have anyone who is a materials writer amongst us in the participants. I think there's, some people think that course book writers and publishers do a great job. Other people are highly critical for a variety of reasons. Has anyone any experience of materials development, or indeed any thoughts on some of these interesting points that Steve has raised so far? And if so, please click on your microphone, your opportunity to give your view.
First, we can let that settle. And
okay, yeah.
This is a funny one, Neil. You'll forgive me. You'll forgive me for being very, very picky and highly pedantic. But A.S. Hornby died in 1978.
He was, however, I believe, the lead on the development of
OS3. But the first edition was in 74, not 95.
I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. Nicely corrected.
I do apologize, but it was bugging me, because I'm interested in the history of our profession.
No, absolutely.
I on the other hand, I'm still alive.
Excellent.
I knew you'd be pleased. Well, I wanted to ask you. You did say that you weren't going to talk about lexical approach, and I was on the one hand I was surprised at that. On the other hand, I completely understood why, because it's a massive, area.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the co-build, which the only course book I've ever liked in my whole career, unless you want to go back to late 70s when there were a couple of things that were okay. I mean, co-build I thought was great because it was authentic language.
Yes.
But a lot of teachers didn't get it. And a lot of teachers didn't get Lewis either. And the part of the reason I'm happy to be challenged on this, but I felt and still feel that one of the reasons that people didn't get Lewis was because he was too aggressive with teachers. He was far too in your face. And he told them that they were wrong for teaching the past tense in a certain way. Anyway, so what I wanted to ask you was, is there a difference in your mind between collocations and chunks?
Very interesting question. A couple of days ago, I'm a member of a couple of Facebook groups, including one I think is called Delta and Dipti Soul Survivors, which perhaps says quite a lot about those particular qualifications. And one of the points that was raised was about teaching get. And it was get as a delexicalized verb: get married, get divorced, get hitched, not just within the context of relationship lexis as a quote unquote lexical set, but as a kind of, and I think this was someone who was preparing for an observed lesson at that level 7 dip level. And what was interesting was the way in which there was, I think, a lot of confusion for teachers about the use of meta-language. Now, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and I know you will do so very graciously, strictly speaking, a collocation is a statistical frequency at which words used together are more frequent than one would expect. So it's actually down to corpus-based linguistics and statistical expectations of words and the company they keep. And the collocation, I think, is often looked at in terms of probably a two-word chunk, sorry, I won't use the word chunk for a moment. I'll use a two-word combination: blue steak, rare steak, and so on. Whereas I think we then get into the wider area of chunks. So, you know, we've got the trinomials, we've got those three-word combinations, and of course I'm desperately trying to think of one at the moment and can't.
Not going to help you.
I can't think of one at the top of my head. So I think for me that, you know, the lexical approach, which wasn't necessary, okay, certainly the case that Lewis brought it to the attention of many, but the research I think was already done, and forgive me for the correct pronunciation, Nattinger and De Chirico really did the kind of were really early on at looking at word
also Paulian Cider, I think, also.
Right. So I think for me, it's less important. Meta language is important, and I think standardized meta language helps teachers to grasp concepts. If we all speak quote unquote the same language, it makes things easier. But as far as the classroom is concerned, I'm less concerned if a teacher talks about a collocation or a word partner, or a chunk. For me, it's this concept for the learner that words occur with certain frequencies that enable us. And here we had in the audience a colleague who I think is flipping in and out, who's an IELTS examiner, that, you know, at the IELTS 7 level, the ability to control what is referred to as collocation really is one of the deciding factors between a student at perhaps a low advanced level and an upper intermediate, and certainly an intermediate level. So it's not the use of the word chunk and collocation, the distinction between them, that I think matters so much as an awareness raising for our learners that in order to approach a natural level of language use, that word selection and word combination selection really does matter. You can't say it's raining dogs and cats. Well, I mean, you could, but it would not sit comfortably with, if you're working and living in the UK or America or Australia, with a native listener. Whereas, of course, it's raining cats and dogs, I wouldn't even think and dream of teaching were I working in a language school in Puglia, because it really isn't either high frequency or B, anything that a student in southern Italy is really ever going to want or need to say.
Or anywhere else, I suggest. I mean, isn't it 1950s language, really, isn't it?
How do you react to that response? In other words, let's think about raising awareness of combinations with students, but not get too hung up on the meta language. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I do agree completely. And I think that that the example that you used of raining dogs and cats is quite interesting. It's also to do, you know, I'd like to have a fork and knife, please. And you go, hang on a minute, that's perfectly okay, isn't it? It's perfectly okay, absolutely intelligible. I mean, I understand it completely. What do we do with that? And that's kind of, I guess it's another area, but it does bring me on to, if you'll forgive me for moving slightly ahead. No, sure. I was interested that you commented that you can't remember the Italian word for knife. And so I thought, because one of the things that I'm very keen on in teaching lexis or vocabulary is the use of mnemonic devices. So little memory aids, right? So I thought, okay, well, the Italian for knife is coltello. And so I would ask you as a student to think about Mount Everest. I'm not completely mad. And then there's a little area of Mount Everest, which is called the South Col. And in that South Col, I want you to see lots and lots of knives that somebody has stuck there. Coltello.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So just an example of what I often use stuff like this, and I wondered whether you do, or whether you rate it at all, or whether you think it's all a bunch of nonsense.
No, not at all, because I think what matters here is two things. One, it's about giving students, and I think this fits into the third strand probably, it's another way, rather like dictionary work, of giving students ways to remember vocabulary better. And sometimes a striking mnemonic provided by the teacher is just enough. Or ask the students to come up with their own mnemonics. So yes, I mean, and of course it's always the way, isn't it? I'm desperately trying to think of some of the mnemonics I've used with vocabulary teaching. And right now my mind has gone blank, but bear with me, in about 5 minutes time, we'll probably remember one.
After the end of the session, you'll remember lots.
And I'll post them on the forum. No, I think that it is incredibly useful. So I think it's about two things. One, in the moment, a mnemonic can help a learner to remember. I'm thinking, okay, so Everest, col, knives in it, coltello. I mean, I can remember your mnemonic. So I might be then thinking, well,
that'll be 37 euros, please.
No problem at all. Can I, if I trade you for a possible mnemonic for forchetta, would that actually give us 0, quids in, euros in? And I might say to a learner, if you look at a fork, it's got prongs. And if you look at the letter F, it also has prongs. That's what I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head right now. But I think it does indicate the way in which we can help students to remember better. But I think as important as the individual mnemonic, or whatever it is also the fact that we give students the capacity to use mnemonics individually for themselves and each other.
Absolutely agree.
We hand it over to them saying, so here's a mnemonic for forchetta and coltello. And then, of course, we've got the last word, cucchiaio.
Yes.
What would can you come up with a mnemonic for your classmates that helps with cucchiaio?
Yes. Yes, no, I absolutely agree. I think that, I think it was Tony Buzan, wasn't it, who makes a very strong point for creating your own mnemonic devices, be they as bizarre and as possible, because that also aids memory.
Perhaps just adding here that, in terms of increasing work in SLA around the kind of the phonological level, as well as the visual level, that in fact, if we think about cucchiaio, for me, the shape of a spoon, what's that bit of the spoon that's not the handle, it's the spoon bit. The shape of it is quite vowel-y, it's quite round. And I think if we think about the word cucchiaio in Italian, it's got, cucchiaio, it's got enough shapes that might approximate to a round sound. And therefore, we think about dual processing and helping our students in their mnemonics, not just to be thinking about the visual level, but also to be thinking at the phonological level. And there seems to be quite a strong evidence base now that this dual processing further enhances movement from short-term working into longer-term memory. So maybe that's another way we can enhance the use of mnemonics.
Absolutely. And in fact, of course, that links in quite well with the idea of graphics with words included in them. The idea of cucchiaio with as a graphic, that would work really, really well. Absolutely. The number of segues in this discussion is quite extraordinary, because another point I wanted to put to you, ask you about. Now, there is that idea that 7 plus or minus 1 or 2 is or there was that idea.
Yes.
And for many years, I taught that to trainee teachers, and I don't think I did too much damage in so doing. But and now there's some idea that perhaps that's too much.
Yes.
And what I wanted to challenge that with, it may be a weak challenge actually, is how Suggestopedia can do so very much more. Because Suggestopedia, if you talk to Lonnie Gold, for example, who's one of the foremost Suggestopedic teachers, he'll happily tell you that students can remember, perhaps moving into the hundreds of words. So how does this work?
Can I just preface your comment, because I don't know if you saw it, but I did post into chat a point in which I challenged my own comment about 7 plus or minus 2. And the reason that I put it into chat is that I haven't got the evidence base to hand. But just to quote, I've also heard it suggested that most studies which suggested 7 plus or minus 2 haven't taken into account more recent studies looking at working memory and lexical processing. It may be that working memory may actually only be able to cope with 2 or 3 new items at a time. Yeah. Now that bit of knowledge came from a lady called Vivian Rogers, who's a second language acquisition expert at Swansea University, where I used to work. And her particular area of expertise is eye tracking. Now I think, but I'm not sure, and I've not been able to find the reference, that 7 plus or minus 2 is often related to first language rather than second language acquisition. Knowing that SLA is a particular interest of yours, I don't know if you can add to that point before we think about Suggestopedia.
I probably can't, to be honest. I mean, I see probably more than many people, I see massive similarities between first language acquisition and second language acquisition, which is not a very popular view, I know, and yet I tend to hold it.
So I think we've got a general feeling that the number of words that, so I look at myself at the beginning of my diploma, I think there were probably about 20 words on this list that I was going to work through with my learners. And I just scraped a bare pass because I was able to say I had too many words. And that stuck with me. And it may be therefore that the number of words we work with are even fewer than actually 7 or 9. Now, I'm no expert. In fact, I wouldn't even begin to say anything like and as knowledgeable about Suggestopedia as you are. So can I ask you, because I know it's an area that you have a particular interest in, this idea that students can somehow work with, you know, many, many more. You mentioned hundreds. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I would be an absolute fraud even attempting to answer that question.
Sorry, it wasn't my intention to put you on the spot in that way.
No, not at all.
I just thought it was. It's really it kind of challenges research.
Yes.
Especially if research is now saying, well, you know, 7 plus or minus 1 or 2 is too many. Perhaps we can only handle 2 or 3 words.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then whatever you might think about the wackiness of Suggestopedia, there is no question that vocabulary acquisition is extremely high in comparison to either of those numbers. And how is that done? Well, it's done through subliminal learning, it's done through relaxation, it's done, as I'm sure everybody here knows, it's done through the use of connecting music and word, I suppose, right brain, left brain stuff. And the other thing which I wanted to say really was that many academics, and I've met lots of them, won't give you the time of day for Suggestopedia. And I do think that's a terrible shame, because Suggestopedia it has shown that it can go beyond what research and even evidence-based processes seem to suggest. And so it's time, in my mind, for somebody somewhere to go, hang on a minute, let's have a look at this a bit more closely, because we may be denying our students fantastic opportunities by not doing proper research into things which enhance memory, super memory, and so on.
Interestingly, not that long ago, Tess Fitzpatrick, whose name I mentioned earlier, was commissioned by the Welsh Government to run a report looking on recommendations for foreign language learning as part of a review of the Welsh education system. And, you know, it matters not particularly that this was, you know, situated within the context of Welsh secondary and primary schools, but as an expert in language teaching, before she became an academic, she was a diploma trainer and highly capable teacher in her own right. And Tess has been learning Welsh, and I think we all bought things that we never actually then used during lockdown. And one of the things I bought, and one of my great regrets, is that I signed up for a course for learning Welsh. And I never actually really got beyond week 1. But what was of interest is the comment that Tess made as one of the users of this course, saying this course should not work, but it does, because she attests that's basically, that's how she managed to start learning Welsh when previous attempts hadn't. So I think whilst we're probably both great fans of evidence-based teaching, nevertheless, I think we have to allow for the fact that some learners will learn in spite of bad teaching, and some learners will learn in ways that we can't really explain and seem to be contrary to cutting-edge empirical-based research. But nevertheless, well, if it works, it works. Of course, the problem is that it may work for Jane, but it's not necessarily going to work for her partner, Julia or Joe, because regrettably, I think it is the case that individual differences account for a significant aspect of why some people, 10 people in a classroom, you're going to get 10 different sets of results. But yes, I'm very much open to the fact that it doesn't really matter how it would be lovely to know how it works, and it would be lovely to get closer to the point where we have a principled approach that works for as many people as possible. But let's not be precious about it and say, well, I don't have an evidence base for that, so actually I'm going to reject it. If it works, it works.
Yeah, and that is a problem in academia for sure.
Can I just, something that Gabby's posted earlier, she posted not that long ago, just as we were starting this question around Suggestopedia, of Gabby said, when you say words, do you also mean chunks? Gabby, I don't know if you're with us at the moment, but can you just explain a little bit more? Because I don't quite remember what I was saying that, or what Steve was saying that prompted that question, but it might be interesting to explore the point you were making. Hi, Gabby.
Hi, Neil.
So your question about words and chunks, can you just refresh our memory where we were at the point in the discussion?
I think it was when you were discussing the number of words that students can realistically remember. So there's 7 plus minus and then 2, 3. And then as I was listening to you, I felt like, right, okay, but what is this 7 plus minus? Because to be honest, I feel a little bit like Steve. I mean, as a CELTA trainer, this is what we are kind of supposed to teach to the trainees, right? Mm-hmm. But I never really felt convinced by this 7 plus minus, to be honest.
If I understand your question correctly, if we're working with a set phrase, does that count as our 7 words?
Well, yeah, that's how So because when we say 7, I mean, teachers will probably understand 7 individual words.
The research suggests that in terms of lexical processing, that a string of highly frequent words that go together as a phrase is processed lexically in the brain as an individual unit and not as 7 individual words. So if we take that awful example of it's raining cats and dogs, that would probably be processed as 1 unit rather than it is raining cats and dogs. So it's not a 6-word item. It's a 1-word item. So we can put it in brackets. And in fact, if it is the case, particularly where we're offering opportunities for rich exposure through, for example, graded readers, that students who indirect learning, that the more opportunities they have for learning expressions and chunks, that they can learn more than if they learn individual words, and they will stick more. I'm not sure if I've explained that very well.
Yeah. I mean, that was exactly my understanding as well. So I just wanted to clarify it, Neil.
Sure.
I think we perhaps should be calling them items rather than words. We should talk about items, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
I wonder if anybody remembers the Rupert Bear manuals. I mean, I'm old enough to remember almost the originals, but if you go back, if you can find any, or one example of the Rupert Bear manual comic from perhaps the 1950s, one of the things that you'll notice is the extraordinary use of language. It's extremely broad and profound, in fact. And I think I'm not going to shout, dumb down and all of that business, but I do think that we expected a lot of our youth as first language learners when I was when I was a child in the 50s. And I do think that we have lost a lot of that now. And that also needs to be taken into account if we're looking at how we acquire vocabulary or lexis or whatever it is we want to call it, because that generation were exposed to a massive amount of extremely complex and low frequency language through those comics. And I think it had an effect.
And interestingly, the research that was done looking at English file and this kind of suggestion that it just wasn't giving them enough vocabulary. Of course, there is a tension, isn't there, between on the one hand saying, well, you can only cope with so much vocabulary load at a time, and then saying, well, actually, but we still expect course books to give us more, was a talk given by Jim Milton. And I think Jim is recognized as being one of the leading names in vocabulary studies, and not without reason chair of the Elton's committee. Jim knows his stuff, basically. And Jim did some research looking at the differences between French language learning tests, basically O-levels, school cert. So we had school certificate, then we had O-levels, and we now have GCSEs in the UK. And basically, his research indicated that the vocabulary requirement today of a first-year student studying French at university was the same as an early GCE O-level student in the 70s. In other words, we really have dumbed down our expectations. Now, we could perhaps try to see whether is there some relationship between the loss of grammar translation, and I'm not certainly suggesting that it should come back in its entirety, and the requirements for a very broad vocabulary, and a move towards CLT, and certainly as far as course books are concerned, the rather dull parsnip topics that we have. And likewise, that concept of tenor, teaching English for no obvious reason. I left school in 1987. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago. Perhaps some of the audience will disagree. But I remember learning French very capably in terms of my oral ability, but also studying Whitmarsh and his French translation and basically grammar translation and text level translation was very much what we were doing. I remember being asked to translate Dickens. Translating Dickens didn't necessarily help me to order a beer or a coffee, but the course also covered that. And I think high demand ELT, which was very much a buzzword 5-6 years ago, I think it was maybe slightly less, did indicate that we were short selling our students. And I think, again, how do we marry the constraints of the classroom and the time that's available, issues around direct language-focused vocabulary teaching, that third strand. So how do we get all the other vocabulary back in? I'm going to suggest that Krashen, as unpopular as he has become, got it right when more recently his focus went into the absolute importance of extensive reading.
Yeah, he's certainly not unpopular with me. I mean, that's talking about exposure, isn't it?
Yeah,
In a way, it's just talking about exposure. The box idea, which for me, I found it much too prescriptive, but that's just me. I'm just not like that. I don't work like that. I wanted to know how you define learned. Is it through use or self-declaration? So you said that the words get moved across as students learn. How do you find learn?
I think it's probably ill-defined, let's be honest. But I think if I give you the example of the Swiss student who really was the most successful user, I don't think he realized it was like in a box. He just basically had boxes and he moved vocabulary around. For him, it was primarily the flashcard had the word in English on one side and the translation on the other, and an example sentence in both languages. So for him, learned meant that I can look at the German word, and we're back to translation, aren't we? And I can give it, within the context of the sentence, its translation in English. Good point. To what extent did that mean that that item was then available to him for oral output?
Yeah.
Question mark. And I think probably this is where the fourth strand of Nation's 4 strands comes in, because if the Leitner box enables certainly a language focus in strand 3, either because the student has encountered the word through meaning-focused input through reading, for example, and then thought, I like this word, this is useful, I'm going to stick it on a card. But really, we then need strand 4 and those 4-3-2 activities in order to enable automaticity, and therefore in what I think it was Peter Grundy was making the point that actually, we talk about fluency and accuracy. Let's come back to your very first point this afternoon about binary oppositions. Peter never really thought that fluency and accuracy was really a valid binary opposition. Mm-hmm. He felt that we should be talking about real-time language use, which combines the two. So I think, coming back to Nation, if we accept that his knowledge was declarative knowledge, it can perhaps become procedural by an intervention by the teacher using something like a fluency-based 4-3-2 activity. So in a way, yes, it's important for our students to be aware of what level of knowledge, what level of understanding do they have. But more importantly, it's for us as teachers to equip them with tools that enable them to move to the end use, which is that ability to use it spontaneously and correctly. And that, of course, that brings us back to that incredibly complex Nation table of what does it mean to know a word. The number of levels that table includes is enormous. Yep. So I think also it means saying to students, you don't need to learn every word, learn quote unquote, to the same degree. I mean, I love the word discombobulation, but I really don't think it's a particularly useful word to teach. It's not a particularly useful word to use. I happen to know in Swiss German that the word for kitchen cupboard is hochhäflich. Yeah, do I need to know that?
Absolutely, you do. Of course you do.
My favorite word in Italian is azzigogolato. But, that's such an unusual term. I mean, for those in the audience that don't speak Italian, it has this idea of overly complex and baroque, but perhaps in a positive way. So you could talk about, an answer being azzigogolata, it was wonderfully complex and detailed and so on. So, that's my understanding as an L2 speaker of Italian. I don't know if we've got we've got Eleonora here. I'm not sure, Eleanor, I'm not sure if you're Russian or an Italian speaker, but the point is that giving students the control in terms of vocabulary, the means to learn vocabulary, and the understanding that they can make decisions for themselves about what they learn puts the learner in control. Our job, it's a bit like being a driving instructor, isn't it? we're not going to do anything other than provide the learner with the skills to navigate their journey as the language learner, using the language in the way that is appropriate for them.
Not as dangerous as being a driving instructor, I suspect.
And, you know, if that includes wheelbarrows or whatever, so be it, so be it.